About 3000 years ago, a young lad named Dawood or David killed the giant tyrant named Jalut or Goliath. David's victory over Goliath became a symbol of victory against impossible odds. Celebrated over centuries in song and folklore by the adherents of Abrahamic religions, the tale of David and Goliath has been invoked numerous times by those willing to glorify the triumph of the underdog. In the wake of the First Arab-Israel War in 1948-49, the Zionists also attempted to cast their triumph as another David versus Goliath episode of history. 5 huge Arab armies descended on the hapless and outnumbered people of Israel, who overcame impossible odds to gain their independence, according to them. However, non-partisan historians have expressed much skepticism about this bombastic Zionist chest thumping. In fact, many historians have claimed that in the First Arab-Israel War, it was actually the Arab David who squared off against the much more powerful Zionist Goliath. The unglamorous reality is that we do not live in biblical times, and the David versus Goliath comparison is completely irrelevant to the First Arab-Israel War. There is no doubt that when the war began, the Zionists were more powerful of the two sides. As the war progressed, this disparity only grew. But the Zionists deserve to be lauded for their dedication and commitment to waging a total war. They managed to train and put 13% of the total Jewish population of Palestine under arms, an immense achievement. The population of Arab countries at war with Israel was more than 40 times that of the Jews in Palestine. Yet Israel managed to achieve numerical superiority on the battlefield. Instead of a fictitious David versus Goliath analogy, Israel of 1948 can be more accurately compared to an entity not far removed from it either chronologically or psychologically. Israel's efficient militarism was somewhat reminiscent of the Nazi war machine that led 80 million Germans to terrorize and subjugate the whole of Europe and its more than 500 million people. I am Dr. Hassan Bukhari, and this is the 11th episode of our series Palestine versus Israel. This is the first of the 2 episodes in which we will discuss the First Arab-Israel War of 1948-49 in detail. Let's begin by examining the forces at the disposal of both sides in May 1948 when the war began. The Arab armies were composed of separate contingents from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. In addition, there were some irregular remnants of the Arab Liberation Army under Fauzi al-Qaouqji and Palestinian volunteers. Initially, in May 1948, approximately 10,000 Egyptians, 4,500 Jordanians, 7,000 Syrians, 8,000 Iraqis, and 3,000 Lebanese troops were massed at Palestine's borders. All in, the Arab men under arms numbered around 40,000. The Zionists, on the other hand, had 40,000 mobilized frontline regular troops organized into 12 brigades. An additional 25,000 were earmarked for garrison duties to protect numerous Jewish settlements and villages. In the words of historian Charles Smith, the Israelis held a manpower advantage over the Arab armies backed by superior military training and commitment. Among the Arab forces, only the Jordanian Arab Legion was properly trained and ready to fight a conventional war. But the Arabs did have one important advantage. They had much more heavy weapons like artillery pieces and armored vehicles than the Zionists. Interestingly, despite their evident weakness, the Arab leaders had done virtually nothing to remedy the situation. They didn't mobilize their populations, they didn't train their soldiers for war, and they didn't even try to buy or get more weapons from abroad. This lack of preparation, though, didn't stop them from issuing threats of war and prophesying the end of Zionists after that war. The strange mix of Arab nonchalance and incompetence on the eve of a major war can be revealed by a bizarre episode narrated by the British commander of the Jordanian forces, John Glubb, in his autobiography, A Soldier with the Arabs. A few days before the war, Glubb reminded the Secretary General of the Arab League that the 65,000 Zionist soldiers in Palestine vastly outnumbered the Arab soldiers. The Secretary General replied, "I expect it will be all right. I have arranged to get up 700 men from Libya." Deficiency in numbers can be made up through better planning. Khalid bin Walid at Yarmouk and Hannibal at Cannae triumphed despite being outnumbered. But the Arabs lost out here as well. Unlike the Zionists, they didn't even have a supreme command to plan and coordinate the operations of their forces. Each contingent went off to fight a separate war against a united and coordinated enemy. The Arab League only began an effort to enlist Arab armies for war after the Zionist capture of Tiberias and Haifa in April 1948. Little planning and much bickering ensued. The lack of planning and even intent of the Arabs can be judged by the fact that they weren't certain of sending their forces to Palestine even 1 week before war broke out. The woeful state of the Arab general staffs can be gauged from the fact that they didn't even have a single military map of Palestine prior to the outbreak of hostilities. Howard Sacker writes, "Advanced knowledge of this extensive terrain was so grossly inadequate that the Syrian and Iraqi general staffs lacked even a single military map of Palestine and were obliged to rely on geographic charts used by school pupils and the advice of civilian guides. Neither was there a unified command worthy of the name. On May 14, Abdullah appointed himself commander-in-chief by virtue of his legion's recognized military superiority in the Arab world. The title was purely honorific. Coordination among the various Arab armies was non-existent." Here, it is pertinent to discuss the enigma that was King Abdullah of Jordan. His Jordanian Arab legion was by far the most professional and well-equipped Arab force. He had been involved in Palestine's politics for more than 2 decades and also had excellent relations with the British. Both geography and history dictated that Abdullah would be a pivotal character in the Palestine saga. Being the eldest son of Sharif Hussein, Abdullah considered Palestine as something of a birthright and wanted to possess it at all costs. Unlike most Arab leaders, he was astute enough to recognize the Zionist power vis-a-vis the Arabs. He also knew that the British rule in Palestine was transitory and his chance to get his coveted Palestine would come at the point of British departure. Abdullah could try to stem the Zionist tide, especially in the years after the 1939 White Paper, which soured the relations between the Zionists and the British. But, like his father, he lacked not only strategic insight but also loyalty to his nation, and only used his intelligence for eventually short-term and unsustainable ends. He underestimated and misunderstood the Zionists as his father had once misunderstood the British. In order to achieve his goal of domination over Palestine, Abdullah chose to parley with the Zionists instead of trying to unify the Arabs against them. Cognizant of Zionist power, he made no effort to increase his and his nation's power, but instead resigned himself to the fact that the Zionists would take over a part of Palestine. He wanted to use a deal with the Zionists to outmaneuver his Arab opponents inside Palestine and lessen his dependence on the British. He also wanted and expected considerable Zionist financial support and subsidies in exchange for his collaboration with them. In his calculations and ambitions, he conveniently ignored the fact that the Zionists openly claimed all of Palestine as Eretz Israel. So, Abdullah chose to betray his nation and collaborate with the Zionists in order to get a slice of Palestine. He preferred a Zionist genocidal state as a neighbor to an independent Palestine ruled by his hated rival Mufti Amin al-Husseini. King Abdullah had maintained contacts with the Zionists throughout the 3 decades of British rule in Palestine. Interestingly, he agreed to the partition of Palestine a decade before the UN when the Peel Commission unveiled its scheme of partition and stipulated that Abdullah be made king of the Arab portion of Palestine as well. In 1946, when Zionist terrorism to oust the British was at its peak, Abdullah met with an emissary of the Jewish agency, Elias Sasson, and reached an agreement with him on the partition of Palestine. In November 1947, a few days before the passage of the partition resolution in the UN, Abdullah received Miss Golda Meir, a future Prime Minister of Israel and confidant of Ben Gurion, and reaffirmed his support for the partition of Palestine in return for a Zionist promise to accept his rule over the Arab portion. Abdullah was only interested in the West Bank and was content to leave all the rest of Palestine, including areas with negligible Jewish populations like the Negev, Gaza, Jaffa and Safed, etc., in Zionist hands. The only point on which agreement couldn't be reached was Jerusalem, which was coveted by both sides. On the night of 10-11 May, barely 4 days before the outbreak of the First Arab-Israel War, King Abdullah again met Golda Meir. He reassured Miss Meir that he accepted Palestine's partition, but he sheepishly informed her that he would have to join the other Arab states in invading Palestine because there was great hatred against the Zionists among all Arabs, including the Jordanians, due to horrible atrocities like Deir Yassin. He also said that he was no longer free to do what he wanted, as now he just represented one Arab state in 5 and the others would go to war even without him. If he stayed back alone, he would surely be labeled a traitor and might even be overthrown, so he had to join this war unwillingly. Golda Meir later reported that Abdullah was going to war not out of joy or confidence, but as a person who was in a trap and couldn't get out. Nevertheless, Abdullah didn't want the Zionists to be defeated, as that might enable Egypt, Syria or the Mufti to rule Palestine. So he formulated a devious strategy. He would join the war but wouldn't attack the Zionists anywhere except in Jerusalem. He would occupy the West Bank and put his forces on the defensive, leaving his Arab rivals open to Zionist offensives. His strategy can be summed up in his own words. The Mufti and Quwatli want to set up an independent Arab state in Palestine with the Mufti at its head. If that were to happen, I would be encircled on almost all sides by enemies. This compels me to take measures to anticipate their plans. My forces will therefore occupy every place evacuated by the British. I will not begin the attack on the Jews and will only attack them if they first attack my forces. Abdullah's strategy met the approval of the British as well, who preferred their lackey as the ruler of Arab Palestine over the Mufti. Secretly, the British and King Abdullah had come to an agreement sometime before the war that the Jordanian Arab Legion would be sent into Palestine as soon as the mandate expired to occupy the parts of Palestine allotted to the Arabs. Thus, Abdullah's stance ensured that the best Arab army wouldn't lift a finger as the Zionists gobbled up 80% of Palestine and thrashed the other Arab forces. Famous Chinese general and sage Sun Tzu has mentioned a method to predict the victor of any war. In his seminal work, The Art of War, he wrote, "By means of these 7 considerations, I can forecast victory or defeat. Number 1. Which of the 2 sovereigns is imbued with the moral law? That is, trust and obedience of the people towards their rulers. Number 2. Which of the two generals has the most ability? Number 3. With whom lie the advantages derived from heaven, that is weather or climate, and earth, that is terrain? On which side is discipline most rigorously enforced? Number 5. Which army is stronger? Number 6. On which side are officers and men more highly trained? Number 7. In which army is there the greater constancy both in reward and punishment? If we analyze the Arab and Israeli forces on the eve of the First Arab-Israeli War, we can easily see that in terms of moral law, the ability of generals, discipline, numbers, training, and robust systems of reward and punishment, the Zionists were miles ahead of Arabs. Hence, the Zionists were in prime position to smash the Arabs in the First Arab-Israel War. Sadly, this pattern of disparity, according to the principles of Sun Tzu, generally persisted in all of the Arab-Israel wars. On the 15th of May 1948, one day after the declaration of Israel's independence issued by Ben-Gurion, Arab armies entered Israel. The Lebanese war effort consisted of little more than a demonstration at the border. The Syrian performance was also completely lackluster. After suffering some setbacks against the Zionist forces, they managed to capture the Jewish settlement of Mishmar Hayarden near the border in June and then remained on the defensive for the rest of the war. The Jordanian and Iraqi forces operated in the West Bank region. Iraq was ruled by family members of King Abdullah of Jordan then, and Abdullah had no qualms with the Iraqi forces operating in his designated area of influence. Jordanians initially occupied the West Bank easily, and the Israelis made no attempt to stop them. But Jerusalem and the road connecting Tel Aviv to it became the scene of major battles. The Jordanians managed to evict the Jews from East Jerusalem by the end of May and shelled West Jerusalem, which had been completely emptied of its Arab residents by the Zionists prior to the war's outbreak, but made no serious attempt to capture it. Fierce battles were fought at Latrun, a key point on the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road. Israelis launched two major attacks on Latrun on 25 May and 31 May, but these attacks failed with heavy casualties. After failing twice at Latrun, the Israelis turned their attention to the construction of an alternate route to link Tel Aviv with West Jerusalem. This road, nicknamed the Burma Road, became operational on June 10 when a convoy from Tel Aviv used it to reach West Jerusalem. Despite the ongoing construction of the Burma Road, the Israelis made another attempt to take Latrun on the 8th of June, but miserably failed again. Overall, the Jordanian Arab Legion gave a very good account of itself on the battlefield, and by the time of the first truce on 11 June, it had managed to capture all the areas coveted by King Abdullah, including East Jerusalem, which included the holy sites of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The Egyptians advanced from the south in two columns. One column advanced through Gaza in the direction of Tel Aviv. An Egyptian force of 2,500 soldiers under the command of Brigadier Najib, a future president of Egypt, managed to reach Ashdod, located 31 kilometers away from Tel Aviv on the 29th of May, and were halted there by numerically superior Israeli forces. Sensing an opportunity to destroy the outnumbered Egyptian column, the Israelis attacked Ashdod on 2nd June to encircle and destroy the Egyptian force. The attack failed due to poor coordination, and Israelis were forced to retreat after suffering more than 400 casualties. Satisfied that Najib could hold Ashdod with his small force, the Egyptian commander General Moawi encircled the well-defended Jewish settlement of Nitzarin, which he had bypassed during the initial advance. On June 7, the defenders of Nitzarin surrendered and the Egyptian rear was partially secured. However, the Israeli Negev Brigade continued harassing the Egyptians and managed to defend most Jewish settlements in the area. The second Egyptian column advanced in northeastern direction to link up with the Jordanians. It reached Beersheba on 17 May and entered Bethlehem on 21 May to link up with the Jordanians. Both Egyptian columns maintained communications through a lateral road passing through the key town of Fallujah. So, when the first truce began on 11 June, the Egyptian forces were present near both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Howard Sacker writes, by June 11, when the first United Nations truce came into effect, Egyptian troops were within artillery range of Tel Aviv and encamped near the suburbs of Jerusalem. They dominated all the main roads of the Negev as well. Conversely, the Jewish reinforcement column in the south had lost nearly 1,200 dead and wounded and urgently needed rest and new equipment. On the 11th of June, the UN finally succeeded in convincing both sides to agree to a 4-week truce. Thus, the first phase of the war ended on 11 June with both sides scoring some success. The Israelis occupied all of northern Palestine and most of central Palestine, but didn't make any serious attempt to attack the West Bank. In the south, the Egyptians managed to advance towards Tel Aviv, but couldn't dislodge Israelis from most of their settlements in the region. Both sides wanted a respite to regroup, and that is why they agreed to a truce. The Israelis especially wanted some time to get more heavy weapons in order to conduct large-scale offensive operations. Interestingly, the Western countries announced an arms blockade for both sides at the beginning of the war, while knowing full well that this embargo would only hurt the Arabs, as the Israelis were freely shipping earlier stored weapons from Europe and the USA. Despite the embargo, the French government deceptively continued selling weapons to Zionists. The French also provided training and storage facilities. The Israelis were also getting large amounts of weapons from Czechoslovakia. According to Howard Sacker, the Czechoslovak government had expressed a willingness to sell the Jews weapons from the Great Skoda works. This decision was in part political, reflecting the Soviet line, in part humanitarian, evincing a traditional Czech compassion on the refugee issue, and in part economic, as the payment was in dollars. On May 20, the Czechs turned over an entire military airfield to the Jews, which in the following months became Israel's principal base in Europe for the shuttle service of arms and planes. Eventually, several Dakota transports commuted back and forth between the two nations, ferrying to Israel dismantled fighter planes, artillery pieces, armored vehicles, and lighter weapons and ammunition. Planes arrived from other countries as well, including bombers and fighters, often flown illegally by veterans of the Allied Air Forces out of Britain and the United States. The bipartisan support of Israel from the USA and USSR ensured that not only Israel would remedy its initial weakness in terms of heavy weapons, but it would also dwarf the Arabs in this respect in a few months. The impact of the truce on the war, Israel's 10-day offensive, Jordan's phony war, Israel's attempts to encircle the Egyptian forces at Fallujah, a brief analysis, and the aftermath of the war will be discussed in the next episode of Palestine versus Israel. Stay tuned, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.